Last video we were reviewing uh, the common terminology used in for Azure resources, right? The Azure Resource Manager. So you had resource group, resource provider, templates, and a declarative syntax. So let's move ahead here. So now you're going to look at resource groups. Okay, so creating resource groups. So resources can be deployed to any new or existing resource group. So deployments of resources, um, deployment of resources to a resource group becomes a job where you can track the template execution, right? So like in terms of deploying a new resource, you could either deploy it to an existing resource group, or you could create a new resource group. And we have seen discussed this previously, that it depends on you on how you want to group the resources in a container, right? If you want to if you want to move it to a separate resource group, or want to club it together, right? So if a deployment fails, the output of the job can describe why the deployment failed. So now we're talking about deployment of resources through the Azure Resource Manager template, right? And in case the deployment fails, we can go into the outputs tab, or I mean, excuse me, you could track the output of the job, and can describe why the deployment failed. So what is the reason it failed, and take corrective action, right, or corrective measures. So whether the deployment is a single resource to a group, or a template to a group. So notice the difference here. So it's talking about just deploying a resource like you would normally do. Like you could deploy a virtual machine to a group. You could deploy a storage account to a group. You could deploy a key vault. You could deploy a vault to a group. You could deploy a web app to a group, right? Are we also are we talking about deploying a template to a group? So you can use the information to fix any errors and redeploy, right? That's why you're talking about corrective action, corrective measures, which could be taken in case the deployment fails, right? Um, Deployments are incremental. So if a resource group contains two web apps and you decide to deploy a third, the existing web app will not be removed. So you're always adding to it, right? You're not, it's not like you can only have one web app in a resource group, and then if you try to deploy the other one, the second one, the first one goes away. It's not that. You keep on adding to the adding items to the resource group, right? That's what you're talking about. And there's some things which we need to consider, that resource groups are at the simplest a logical collection of resources, right? You group resources in a container, just um, and that's grouped logically. Notice that it's logical, and logical depends on on what you perceive to be logical, what you perceive to be logical for a particular project, right? um, so there are a couple of small rules for resource groups. Resources can only exist in one resource group, meaning that you cannot have a resource that can exist at the same time in multiple resource groups. So they can only belong to one resource group at a given time. Resource groups cannot be renamed. That is very interesting, and a good point to know. So you cannot just edit the resource group name and rename it. That is not possible. So once you set a name, it's set for life. So uh, um, Resource groups can have resources of many different types. So you could have a resource group which could contain a virtual machine, a storage account, a vault, a web app. Could have many different kinds of or types of services in a resource group. And resource groups can have resources from many different regions. This is again very important in terms of exam questions, because obviously they're going to test us our understanding of resource groups, and you might have a trick question about if it's possible to add resource groups from different regions. Say you could have like if you have a resource group in East US, and then you have another resource group in I'm talking about, excuse me, I'm talking about, okay, so let's say you have a virtual machine in East US, and then you have a storage account in East US 2, which is another location, another region, right? So is it possible to add those two uh, resources um, into the resource group because they're in different locations? But the answer is yes, you can, based on the statement right here that resource groups can have resources from many different regions. So it's important to understand that because we are trying to prepare for a test, and you need to understand what kind of questions come, and this is where they're going to test you, right? They're going to test you, or they're going to test us. They're going to test us on the different regions, right? I mean, um, that's one way they could probably test, right? If you could, if it's possible to add uh, resources from different regions into a resource group. Okay, so moving along, let's talk about creating resource groups. So there are some important factors to consider when defining your resource group. All the resources in your group should share the same lifecycle, meaning you deploy, update, and delete them together. So it should not happen that so you have, let's say you have a virtual machine and a storage account, and then you at one given point of time you're deploying the virtual machine, but at the same time you're trying to delete the storage account. So the in this case the virtual machine and the storage account, they are on they're both on different life cycles, right? Because one is in the deployment stage, the other is in the deletion stage. So all of the resources in the resource group should belong to the same life cycle, or should share the same life cycle. So you deploy, update, and delete them together. So if one resource, such as a database server, needs to exist on a different deployment cycle, it should move into another resource group that shares the same life cycle, right? So that is really important. That's very important to know. And I'm going to list those. I'm not going to list all the points because you can go through this, but I'm going to list some points which I feel is important in the description. So each resource can only exist in one resource group, which you have seen, which you already seen. You can move a resource from one resource group to another group, and that's what you've seen um, on the first point, right? Because if you feel, or if you see that one of the resources in the resource group does not share the same life cycle as the rest, move them to another resource group, right? Move them to another resource group where it shares the same life cycle. um, you can add or remove resource. Okay, so you can add or remove a resource to a resource group at any time. You can move a resource from one resource group to another group, which you've seen. A resource group can contain resources that reside in different regions. We've also seen that. A resource group can be used to scope access control for administrative actions, and um, a resource can interact with resources in other resource groups, which is also interesting. So this interaction is common when two resources are related but they don't share the same lifecycle. That's what we're talking about, right? For example, web apps connecting to a database. That's where we stand on that. And then when creating a resource group, you need to provide a location for that resource group. Okay, so um, I mean, in terms of where it should reside, right? So when you may be wondering, why does a resource group need a location, right? That's a common question one would ask. Like, why would it need a location? Because we know for a fact that resources have locations, right? Like if you're setting up a virtual machine, you're setting up in a location. It could be setting up in East US. It could be setting up in East US too. It could be setting up in West US, right? You could be setting it up in any of those locations. Um, but now you're talking about that. Now you're seeing that um, like while creating a resource group, we need to specify the location. Um, and if the resources can have different locations, if the resources can have different locations in the resource group, um, why does the resource group location matter at all, right? That's also an important question. um, and the resource group stores metadata about the resources. Therefore, when you specify a location for the resource group, you are specifying where that metadata is stored, where the metadata of the resources are stored. For compliance reasons, and this for compliance reasons, you may need to ensure that your data is stored in a particular region, right? That's important. And there's a point to note that by scoping permissions to a resource group, uh, you can add or remove and modify resources easily without having to recreate assignments and scopes. So let's go through this one more time. And it says that by scoping permissions to a resource group, you can add or remove and modify resources in the resource group easily without having to recreate assignments and scopes. And so you'll be able to do all of the above, right? Add, remove, modify without having to recreate permissions and all that. So yeah, so looks like we completed this unit. I'm going to list some of the points in the description, which I think is important, and feel free to go through this um, uh, section. I mean, the link is in the description, and in the next video we'll be looking to see how we can create Azure Resource Manager logs. So until then, see you next time.